This week on the show, we've got Clint Ballinger. Clint is an historian on money, and we love money on Steve and Friends. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. It's May 27th, 2023. We're heading into the summer. Welcome all. Joe Polito, Hugh N. Thanks for saying hi. We've got Clint Ballinger today on the show. You can find me at Ty Keens on Twitter, at Ty Keens on LinkedIn, tykeens.com, and on my Patreon, patreon.com/tykeens. You can watch all of these episodes we do each week on Steve Keen's YouTube channel. So if you've missed some, you can always go back and watch them. I know it's a long weekend in the United States, so you might be doing something. Mike was telling me over on the East Coast in the Boston area, a lot of people start doing the garden. So if you got gardening to do, you can go do your gardening if you really have to. Come back and watch this later. But what I want you to do is hit the like button. Please do that. If you're watching on Twitter right now, the live feed over there, hit the like button there, retweet, then come over here, join the chat. I'm going to bring on Daniel Sanderson first. Daniel, here we are.
Hey!
Daniel, how was your week?
Fantastic, man. Fantastic. Yeah.
Good. What's going on in the world of planksip.org?
Well, we had a revamp of the website. It's redone, and we thought that it just needed a facelift, and so we've got a redesign on there. It's much there's a lot of new content coming out, and a lot of new authors participating. So it's we're very excited to see and share it with everybody else.
Yeah. Now give us a brief rundown. What is planksip.org again?
Planksip is a media outlet that focuses on culture and philosophy. And so articles just orientate around that. We're not really chasing ambulances or the latest headlines. It's more about the love of literature and philosophy. So philosophy, that just means the love of wisdom. And so if you like that sort of thing, Planksip may be a home or a place that you want to spend some time.
You're so fucking inspiring to me, Daniel.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's bring on Mike. Can we bring on Mike now, Dan?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Mike.
Yeah. Hi, gents.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you guys.
Are we going to be swearing a little bit this week, Mike, since Steve can't actually make it on the show?
I don't know. My mom watches this, you know. I'll get a phone call.
Well, hello to Mike's mom. We appreciate you tuning into the show. Mike, what's been going on over the last week for you?
Oh, well, so we had one of our PhD students go through his PhD dissertation defense this week, and it was quite nice because present PhD students and former PhD students and faculty all joined to watch what happens and ask him questions and then celebrate. And he worked on bringing behavioral economics into system dynamics in a manner that would be deemed acceptable by both system dynamicists and behavioral economists. So it was very nicely done. And so that consumed a lot of my week.
Right. So we've got the hasty ent, no peer pressure to swear or anything, but If you did swear, I would clip it out and make a promotional and put it all over social media. I'm not going to lie. So there is that risk. If you do come across that slight courage, you know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to shock these guys and say, fuck. I will be clipping it and making something very special out of it. So just be warned.
It may even end up on your local radio channel too, right? Well, that might just be like the morning show or something like that, right?
Violation of FCC guidelines.
Yeah.
Mike, remind everybody what university you teach at.
Yes. So I'm at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're located 40 miles from Boston, directly west from Boston as the crow flies.
Ah, very nice. And what do you specialize at WPI?
Well, my title is I'm a professor of economics and system dynamics. So my thing is figuring out how to do economic modeling with this tool we call system dynamics. And there are various software solutions for doing system dynamics modeling, including Minsky, which was created by Steve Keen.
Steve Keen, and go ahead, Dan.
So I have a question for you, Mike. With that in your title of a system dynamicist, when you first got the title or the position was created for you at that university, did you have to negotiate or add system dynamicist into the title of professor of economics? Like, I'm curious if that was something that you uniquely brought to that position at the university.
It wasn't a negotiation. They basically said, "What do you want on your business cards?"
Oh yeah.
But I came to the university for one and only one reason, because as I mentioned in the pre-show, I'm from Wisconsin, as is my wife, and all of our brothers and sisters and parents and whatever are from there. So we moved across the country for one and only one reason: to start a program examining the interface of system dynamics and economics. And so it was in some sense natural that we put that on my business card. And then our other faculty who work in the space have the same title. They're professors of economics and system dynamics. And in fact, our PhD student I described, who just passed this week, that will be literally on his diploma. It'll be a doctorate in economics and system dynamics.
Wow.
Mike, it's your turn. We're going to bring it up here. Top chatters from last week on the Steve and Friends live stream. Mike, go ahead, read them.
Oh, okay. Well, Joe Polito, Ghost on the Half Shell, WWE Fan 0104, TR, Lana Dell Hates the Clock, Bach Mandela, Agam the Bold, James Keenan, Demetrius Gazellus, and Dregai.
Good job. Well done. Ladies and gentlemen.
How did the ladies on the couch, though, Ty? Like, that was worth some. Come on. Like, did they not get their coffee in the morning?
Me and the ladies had a heavy night of drinking 12 hours ago. So we're all a little bit.
They're all sleeping on the couch.
We're all sleeping on the couch. So inappropriate. We've gone inappropriate. I'm bringing on Clint. Clint Ballinger. Here he is.
Hey guys.
Hi, Clint.
Oh, there they are. There they are.
I think I should start swearing.
Yeah, well, they love that.
I've always followed Kurt Vonnegut on swearing. He wrote that it's an excuse for people not to listen, but I still might get riled up, so you never know.
Clint, how you doing, buddy?
Doing good. It's good to finally be on here.
Good stuff. Let's kind of start right in it. Who is Clint Ballinger? What is your field of study? How did you get into that field of study? Kind of lay it all out for us.
Sure. Well, my main interest ultimately became economic geography. So in many ways, it kind of deals with one of the oldest and most fundamental problems of political economy, I guess you'd say, is why are some areas developed and some not? and that can be at any scale. So global scale, you get into, industrial revolution and all of that. As a matter of fact, early on, a book on that is kind of what led me in that direction. Age old question. And then, more micro, a lot of that was in the 90s, was real big. Everybody wanted to be the next Silicon Valley. So a lot of economic geography studies on either how to become the next Silicon Valley or, why did it start and so on. I ended up, as a matter of fact, doing my master's in Chapel Hill with the Research Triangle, which is one of the earliest attempts to create a new Silicon Valley, and Chapel Hill, Duke, and Durham and Raleigh. And so there's kind of, and then while I was doing that degree, actually, I ended up, it was a really cool program at Chapel Hill. They sent us to Europe because the program I was in was focused on the EU, US-EU relations. And I was in England and Italy, and both those countries have pretty well known within them development divides. So Northern England versus, the London area, Southern England. And then, of course, the Mezzogiorno, as they call it, the North-South divide in Italy. So I just kind of kept running up against that kind of concept. So, and that's kind of how I ended up ultimately in the long run with actually through Steve Keen and John T. Harvey were probably the two earliest people who pushed me in the right direction. We're looking into the economics, studying economic geography. You have all the classic geography literature, which dates back a long time. It's a shame more people don't know about it, as a matter of fact. So many of the questions that economists deal with, geographers were talking about in the 40s and 50s in a lot of detail and in quite sophisticated way, but they never cite that literature. But so obviously you turn to economics papers to, on the economic side, you're kind of dealing with geography, political science, some sociology, and economics. And every time I looked at the economics literature, I was just like, I was looking for something that would be applicable to what I was studying, and it just seemed so bad, But it took me a long time to realize kind of what was going on. That's kind of a theme of mine, is that I think good economics should make sense to a sociologist or political science or scientist, and not because it's not mathematical or how it's presented, but actually in the topics they're covering. So little by little, I kind of realized something wasn't right with the econ literature. It wasn't answering questions that I thought were relevant or in a relevant way. And eventually, I started running into more post-Keynesian stuff, and and then went in that direction. And I kind of, in my dissertation, kind of finished what I wanted to write about as far as economic geography. There's a million things more I could write, or I could write what I wrote in the past better, but I became more and more interested in the economic aspects of it.
Well, tell me what's wrong with economics in this day and age. Kind of suss that out with us. I know it's a complex, large bundle of fuckery, but give it your best shot. What's wrong with economics?
In a nutshell, they don't look at the real economy. It's scholastic. How many angels on the pin of a head. They've hemmed themselves in a number of ways, but probably the primary one was a change for their own methods constricted them. Instead of looking at problems and saying, okay, what do we need to do to answer that question? They said, what do we have? They became more and more mathematical in the 50s and 60s, and then up till now. And that if you try to write a clean little algebraic equation, you leave out everything that matters. That's in a nutshell what's wrong with it.
Right. Mike, Clint kind of touched on something that you always bring up is, real economists actually going into a factory and, learning about the processes that actually happen that make economics, kind of inject your opinion there, and we'll get the conversation going on what's wrong with economics.
Yeah. Clint's absolutely right. Jay Forrester, one of my mentors, creator of System Dynamics, used to always say to me, why are you writing papers for economics journals? All you're doing is writing for other economists, and they don't care about the economy. They care about publishing papers in economics journals. And Yeah, I think he's absolutely right. You're socialized when you go into the business of being a professional economist. You got to study all the, take tests and all that stuff. But there's a socialization process, and you very quickly learn how you get ahead in the profession and how you lag behind and are seen as a practitioner. Like if you look at the real economy, you're a practitioner. You obviously don't have the intellectual firepower to do theory, to work at the highest levels. And so people don't want to study economic history or history of thought or any empirical stuff. They want another course in topology so they can do crazier theory, that, 5 people in the world can read and 2 people care about. There was a very famous study done by Dave Colander, and I think he had a co-author. I don't remember who it is off the top of my head, but they surveyed new PhD students coming into some of the top economics programs. And they asked them a whole bunch of questions, including, why do you want to study for a doctorate in economics? And the students overwhelmingly said, I'm concerned about the economy or poverty, inflation. I'd like to do something about it. And then they interviewed the same people when they were coming out of the program. And they were like, do you care about the economy? They're like, no, I care about not having enough topology or advanced math to do theory papers. So their education just beat it out of them. The whole reason they went to study economics in the first place. So it's a sad indictment, I think, in my profession. And I don't know what to do about it other than my mentor, Forrester, would say, don't write for other economists, write for the general public, the business community. They will like what you have to say. And who cares, if you get a publication in an economics journal.
Right. I have to jump in here a little bit and defend theory. So, because what I'm hearing from you, Mike, is that theory is like an echo chamber, and if you get out into the real world, you're no longer practicing or a practitioner of theory, which is like the most difficult part of economics, right? I mean, it's let's say where the talent is, right? Instead of like an engineer, it's more of an Albert Einstein of economics. So explain to me how somebody can take theoretical thinking into the mainstream, and why aren't those two worlds compatible?
Well, there's theory and there's theory. I mean, most theoreticians in economics have to follow a certain set of assumptions and structures to be taken as legitimate. So, macro models, even if they're Keynesian, have to have the rational expectation assumption in them, typically at the top journals. And if you don't, it's just dismissed as, well, you're not on the cutting edge, you don't know what you're doing. And there are similar restrictions at the micro level. So, yeah, you want, when you do an investigation in the real world, you don't want just a complete, brainwash, snowflakes in your mind. You want to have some reference points and what have you. So certainly in that sense, theory is useful, but you don't want it to be so structured that you're going to try and jam the square peg into the round hole, even when it doesn't fit, because you have to follow these strict guidelines.
Yeah, well, I'm going to bring Clint on and ask him the same question. I mean, and I'll preface it with a response to Mike, in that theory. You take somebody like Steve Keen, and he seems to be one of these rebels in the field of economics. Clint, do you view him the same? And how do you integrate theory? And do you shatter preconceptions? How do you do it? How do you challenge and reform the field of economics? What are your thoughts, Clint?
Going back to something Mike said, and you asked about putting the two together, I think we could bring it back to kind of money and MMT in this case. There was something I wanted to say about MMT anyways. It's something I've highlighted in my blog before. Basically, sometimes people get their expectations criticize MMT for not, say, having all the answers on a lot of economic problems. But MMT was very specifically about the accounting of government spending and those details. And I'll say how this brings the theory in a second. But basically, it's not that MMT is the answer to everything. It's getting the accounting right, though. And Keen relates to that as well, of course. And if you don't have the accounting right, none of your theory can be right, none of your macro theory. So that's it, once again, in a nutshell, mainstream macro, it doesn't get the accounting right. So so if you don't get the accounting right, you can never be correct. That's just a fact. It's not even disputable. And whereas MMT gets the accounting right, and that sheds light on many of the most important issues, especially policy issues. So that core there is the contribution. And an interesting thing in Keen's trajectory was he was doing amazing things from the banking side, which really wasn't the main focus of MMT. It's more the state money side. But it was when Keen was being criticized by MMT people for not being stock flow consistent or double entry accounting consistent. And I think it was Neil Wilson who got them together and got Keen's model to be redone as double entry accounting. And you could see what needed to be slightly changed to make it work. And I think that was a big step for both sides. And that was an amazing moment. That was about 10 years ago, maybe. But anyways, so I think that's one important area where theory meets reality. And, the emphasis on right accounting by MMT. And then also, to me, that also helps answer the question of, hey, you don't do everything. But it's the critique from MMT side is that none of your macro is going to be right, no matter what you're doing, what your theory, what your mathematical model, if your accounting doesn't match the real world. And accounting is pretty cut and dry and straightforward, which is the good thing about it. And there's a tremendous amount of insights, like I said, that are particularly policy relevant for certainly regarding issues of austerity and things like that. So that's one area where I certainly see the two coming together.
Mike, put the hat on of a neoclassical and counter Clint's perspectives there and make a defense if you can. And I'm saying not make a defense in the mind of Mike Brzezinski. I'm saying make a defense in what you would hear on a neoclassical traditionalist head in the sand sort of position.
Well, it's a little hard to generalize because not all neoclassicals are the same. But I guess I would say money is just sort of floating over the real economy. Money is usually neutral in a lot of models, meaning it only changes the general level of prices or inflation, at least in the long run. And so it's sort of a secondary worry, if it even is a worry. It doesn't make it into a lot of models. And I joke with my students, we finally get to money later in the course. And I said, you all think economics is all about money. You haven't seen any money anywhere for 2/3 of the course. We're finally getting to it because a lot of that is dismissed as, less than important. Whereas, in modern monetary theory, first of all, money matters. And then getting it right, which is following principles of accounting, and going back to the Medici's, in Florence, that's how it's done. I was always, Clint's a money historian. As a young student years ago, I was always struck by the Yap money, the giant circular stone. They look like giant coins. In the textbook, I said, well, this is money. And you're like, well, how do you get that into a vending machine, that giant coin? Well, modern monetary, and nobody could ever tell me until modern monetary theory. Well, money is a scoring system. That was a scoreboard, right? It's like, oh, okay. Oh, that's all you had to tell. So, so money matters in heterodox economics, and getting money right, which basically means how does the world do money, which is double entry accounting. And then, wow, once you do that, like everything, as Clint is saying, opens up, including lots of policy debates can be examined in a different light.
Well, Clint, that's helpful for me because it was a sticking point with me for MMT, because I have to admit that I was playing into the idea or the fallacy of MMT as a silver bullet for funding things, and they predominantly would be climate related things are what kind of came to my mind, right? But I found that when I pushed academics hard enough or people in the MMT field, I got like I get sort of a non-answer, and then so I'm retracing my steps. I'm going back to this point to say that MMT is not the catch-all, but it's about getting the accounting right. And so I want you to speculate for a minute for me, Clint, is that let's say we get it right. We get the accounting right. Then what? And I'm thinking, what Mike said, it's like, well, then it opens up policy. Okay, well, that's my point. So now we have a different way to approach spending as it's related to policy. So it's more than accounting. Am I not getting that correct, Clint?
So money is above all an organizing tool. And there's two systems that we link together by making them use the same unit of account. But we organize public goods with our government spending. I mean, it's practically by definition. If the government does something by us, we the people, in theory, if it's a good democracy, we've organized something. So we've said, hey, we want to build a cabin in a national park. That's in theory, in practice, sort of a group effort by everyone in the country. So it's about the real resources. Do you have carpenters and wood and a piece, and have you set aside the land? And then the tax, as we know, the MMT story, that's what gives value to that, to the unit of account, and you organize that. But ultimately, what you're looking at is what you have organized. And then banking goes also off of that, uses that unit of account and extends credit in it. And they're sanctioned by the state. That's why they're able to function as they do. In other words, we will allow the state to prosecute non-payment of a debt by a bank. That's the key. But the banking sector is primarily about private activity, obviously, and hopefully, ideally, primarily production oriented. So from the kind of perfect view, you want people taking out loans through the private money system that start businesses and factories that also increase public well-being ultimately. And there's a profit motive there. That's fine. That does motivate people. But anyway, so that's all it is. So it's about organizing public and private things. So that's why it's inherently policy. But the key thing with M&A is you need to understand it like that. So we're never in debt, as long as obviously we want a stable price level, which we put a number on that, the CPI or whatever. It's incredibly complex, as we've seen in the last years. There's many different things that can affect the price level. But if you're doing everything right, which has to do with not just how much you spend, but how you spend, how you tax, which would be much more of the conversation as well. If your private and public sector are investing intelligently in production, then your supply should be roughly meeting your demand. And you get that right, and you just have a system where then you can organize public goods. And that's what it's all about. And that's where MMT directly gets to something that's rubber meets the road, helpful to the people.
Great conversation going on here. Make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. If you're over on Twitter, make sure you like there, retweet there, then come over here, join the chat. I'll do my finger thing. I still haven't made a graphic to do this, but make sure you chat. There's a lot of good chatting going on, a lot of good information. There you go, Daniel. A lot of good information. Our viewers are some of the smartest viewers I see on a live stream anywhere. That are really insightful. So the conversation you can have there is in itself something really special. I'm going to keep letting Dan run the show here because he's doing a really good job. I think we should let him do this more often. It's usually just me swearing and saying a bunch of bullshit, trying to get a rise out of people, when really we need those hard-hitting questions that Daniel provides. Daniel, lead it away.
Guys, I don't know if it's just me following in the Socratic tradition, and I'm not trying to say that I'm like Socrates, but for me, it really I keep circling back, and I like listening to people explain what MMT is. so that the average person can understand it. Ty said before, it's like, whether it's comic relief or whatever it is that I'm bringing to the show, it's like, let's just explain it in simple terms again. So, circling back onto MMT, I remember I'd asked Steve Keen a couple episodes ago. I said, what would the financial detriment be, even if it was minuscule, to the government or governments basically just carte blanche funding Steve Keen to the extent of every dollar that he needs to, to kind of move his work in the direction that he wants to move it in, right? Okay. And Steve was very quick to answer that. He said it would affect the economy absolutely zero. It would not affect it whatsoever. And so I think that's very interesting. Like, this is the first step in MMT is getting the accounting right, but then there's this possibility of a new future on how to spend money. And I'd like you to tell us about that and what kind of possibilities a reimagined the reimagined possibilities that MMT could afford us. That would be, I guess, a good starting point. What do you think? Like, what would it be, like an equalization of the art spending versus science? Talk to me about the possibilities, Mike.
Well, okay. So always remember, modern monetary theory is not modern. It's been around for a long time in various forms, and it's not really theory. It's mostly a mechanical description of how a fiat currency system operates, right? So there's, if you would go and talk to bankers and central bankers and whoever, say, what do you do? And you map it out. That's kind of modern monetary theory. It's hard to dispute that. But there is some subjectivity to it, which would be the size of the public sector desired by the population. So somehow, whether it's a dictatorship, pure democracy, a republic, whatever, there's some mechanism for a decision being made as to the size of the public sector. Now, that's a subjective thing. Do you want a giant military or a smaller military? Do you want more judges and courts and clerks to adjudicate disputes or not? Do you want private schools or public schools? Or, do we need better roads and bridges, and on and on it goes? Or do we need to fight climate change, whatever? So there's some process that determines that, and then hence the size of the public sector. And then modern monetary theory says, all right, how do you move the goods and services to the public sector to make that happen? And where it's hard for people to understand all that, I think, is the old fallacy of composition, going back to Keynes, the paradox of thrift. If you save more, good for you. If I save more, good for me. If everybody saves more, ceteris paribus, there's a recession. Well, similarly, I have to balance the budget at my house. You have to balance the budget at your house. GD, there's my swear. The government has to balance its budget.
That was so light. You had to tell us. I don't think anybody would have noticed the swear unless you told us.
Check.
Wow. That was sneaky move. Sneaky move. Okay. The profanity just is nonstop here on the Steve Keen Show.
But people don't think that way. The average person doesn't think that way. And if you study MMT at all, you start to release your mind from those constraints. I mean, you look in Washington right now, they've been just fighting over raising the debt limit in the U.S. And modern monetary theory says, well, go ahead and have one of those, but it's unnecessary, right? The U.S. isn't going to default. It can always pay for anything that's priced in dollars, U.S. dollars, right, including debt. Yet they don't, for political reasons or who knows why, they haven't released their minds, or they're afraid. They understand, but they're afraid the public doesn't understand, or who knows what reason. So if the public can be educated to say, look, it's not, the central government's budget is not like your household budget or your company budget or your city government's budget or your state budget, which are all users of the currency, not creators, right? If you can make that conceptual shift, now it opens up all sorts of possibilities for public sector programs. Now, you might say, modern monetary theory is silent on what programs. Maybe we want the world's most gigantic military and we want 400 aircraft carriers and whatever. Well, that's modern monetary theory is silent on that. There's a way to fund that, but whether that's a good idea or not versus a Green New Deal or guaranteed annual incomes for everybody, whatever the case may be, that's not an MMT thing. That might be an economics thing or a political economy thing, but really that's not in the sandbox of modern monetary theory.
My good Irish friend Phil has a question here for Clint. Does he have another book in the pipeline?
Yeah, can I just answer the previous question real quick, and then I'll get to Phil's question?
You can do that.
Just real quick on how policy changes with an MMT understanding. The quick answer is it doesn't. One key thing that the popular version on the internet of MMT doesn't get right is nothing changes at all. Any government, currency issuing government spending is always the same. You spend, you tax, you impose the tax first, but you tax, and then what you don't tax back is left in the public. The math, the accounting cannot be different than that. So nothing changes. The only thing now is we have a convoluted systems where also the banking system changes some things of that, but the basic underlying for government money, that never changes. And so what we don't tax back now ends up getting turned into treasuries. And that's what confuses everyone. And that's what we're calling debt. But under any system, the formula would be spending equals taxes plus savings. That cannot change for a currency issue. So really it doesn't change anything. Our House of Representatives in the US anyways, decides what to spend and how to spend it on. There's complications with the executive branch, but anyways, that's basically it. So that doesn't change. The main understanding that would change would be, going back to the organization thing I said earlier, it's what we decide to do as a public. But that the accounting of that never changes and cannot change. So we just have a very Byzantine vestigial system that makes the public think that there's debt, which serves some people well, certainly anybody who wants austerity. So part of it, MMT, is just educating people that the spending is always what you don't tax back is saved, period. That's it. And so nothing would change if we went to a simpler system as far as the underlying accounting. It would just be that the public and their elected representatives could understand it better. So it would make it more clear that, hey, we want high-speed rail. Well, we have the metal, we have the engineers. It would have a lot of benefits. Let's just do it instead of all this complicated stuff added on that confuses the public and gives purchase to the austerity-oriented or small government libertarians or whatever to attack everything on these complicated ways. So anyways, that's basically how I see it, coming together. But that basic equation, that's so key, is nothing changes at all. No matter how convoluted, no matter what system, it doesn't matter if you're Britain, Australia, Poland, Brazil, government spending equals taxes plus savings, no matter what the system is.
Gotcha. So now, to Phil's question, we want to hear it. Do you have a book in the pipeline?
Well, what my interest? So I was you mentioned money on this as my interest in money was sort of incidental. It had to do with my undergraduate as an archaeologist, archaeology degree, and I happened to work with Denise Schmandt-Besserat, which is the kind of the key personality behind the oldest archaeological artifacts that taught us where accounting and language both came from, which was the exact same root, which is interesting. Written language came from symbols for accounting about 8,000 years ago, more 10 actually. They keep pushing the date back. So that was one area. And then when I wrote the first book, I kind of set myself up for a problem that I didn't realize. And if you're familiar with the book at all, the basic premise was let's describe, I had to put 10,000 people on an island instead of just the classic economic example is 1 or 2 people on an island, which conveniently cuts out all the emergent properties that we're interested in. So I made up an excuse for why there'd be 1,000 so I could deal with some of those emergent properties, because money is an emergent phenomenon of society and banking as well. And yeah, so, and then I tried to set up basically what you considered like the cleanest system that could be understood. And then I contrasted that in the second part of the book with our real world system and a couple of reasons why the system we inherited from the early modern period of state building is so complex. It's not any different than what I said earlier, spending equals taxes plus savings, but it seems a lot more complex, which makes sense. We inherited all these institutions from 1800s England and blah, blah, blah. So I got to the point, though, I didn't think about it, but this gets into the myth of barter and all that. How do you get that first trend change into money? And that's where I got into a lot of, you might say hot water because people didn't like, but yeah, I would challenge, here's a simple way to say it. I would challenge anybody to write.
Hey, Clint,
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off. What was the name of your book that has
It was
been published?
1,000 Castaways. So it's meant to be like a fun intro, and yeah, thank you. Just to it's meant to kind of be at either like high school seniors or freshmen, just a quick read for like to get them thinking differently. I think economics should be taught. Like day one should be how government spending works, and basically that would be like Econ 101, and then Econ 102 would be banking. Because it's our monetary system, banking, as we talked about earlier, that organizes stuff that's you know, what actually matters as far as policy. And you know, it's crazy that mainstream economics cuts that out. It's kind of convenient as well. That's, you know, that's where it actually makes it, you know, anything gets done. So that's the key thing we should be looking at, actually. But anyway, so trying to start that, I could talk to a whole nother hour about that, but that's where I ran into some problems. As far as the next book, though, my interest has actually been, and this is for you system dynamics people, emergent properties in society. So, you know, I said money itself is an emergent property, complexity. And also from a point of view of policy now, one of our big problems, I think, is over complexity, certainly in our financial system, financialization, which is two things. One, it's too much complexity to be governable or even useful. It allows a million chinks for grifters to get in, which is basically, you know, so much of our finances just grift. And yeah, so it's a major, so I'm interested in complexity and causality in the social sciences. That was actually one of my focus on the big long-term questions in my dissertation. So yeah, I'm looking at doing some papers maybe on that with somebody I'm talking to right now.
Fascinating. I'm very interested in that. Can you unpack a little bit your understanding of emergent phenomenon and how to approach describing what an emergent phenomenon is? Because this is in my view, this is human consciousness too, right? So Clint, can you unpack how do you approach describing this idea of emergent phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, the classic definition, I think, you know, something about the sum is greater, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when you get interactions between usually many things, whether people or institutions, you can get completely, you know, nonlinear. You get feedback is a key aspect of it. Things that happen. So, you know, classic, you look at molecules of hydrogen and oxygen, and you know, you combine them and you get all these crazy properties of water and so on and so forth. You just get that at massively greater scales with more and more things. So I divided causality in my early work, and this is for the big questions, and it runs into geographic determinism. You get this kind of basic, when you want to tell a story, part of the story, and this is why I did it in geography, is where it happens. So you can describe a process all day and say, this is, you know, this led to this, and that's the emergent properties. But then you have to anchor it somewhere. Why did it happen in England, the Industrial Revolution? Or why things like that. And so the more I looked at it, I saw causality as being at this base level of why things happen where they are, which gets complex. And then, but you get your higher order stuff that's so far removed from that the where is not the question anymore. Say the interactions of parliament in one country versus another. Also, you get into institutions in that as well. The details of decisions about the parliamentary procedure that were taken 100 years ago massively affect what happens. And that has policy implications because it's why you get healthcare in one country and not in another or whatever. It could be some obscure rule of the way committees are formed or whatever. And these are all emergent properties. So, and when you get into that, as much as my interest was in big spatial questions, you realize, well, that's not really a spatial question anymore. That's all about the emergent properties. So these complex interactions, they lead to unexpected. The debt ceiling is a perfect example of that. We have a 1917 rule that's interacted with all kinds of social movements now that's creating the thing that's happening right now in the US. So there's no way to summarize easily because the very thing about emergent properties are nonlinearity, the feedback, the complexity. It's complex.
No, that's very helpful. Mike, do you come across or describe emergent phenomenon in your work?
Sure. It's a function of nonlinear dynamic systems where you get a behavior that occurs, in my case, during a simulation that is different from the initial behavior. So one example would be path dependency, where you don't have any particular dividing up of a market into market shares or something like that. And you usually there's a stochastic process involved, some randomness involved, but there's also these feedback loops. And if enough random events shove a system in a certain way, they get locked into a particular path that was not preordained at time zero. So that's one example. A classic example that I think really illustrates it very nicely was done by Tom Schelling. He's passed away, but he was an economist at Harvard. I actually had his son in class. And his father, like 1971, was on a plane ride back to Boston. And he was just killing time, sort of musing on the plane. And he wondered why cities had ethnic neighborhoods. Most cities have, a German neighborhood, Italian neighborhood, Japanese neighborhood, whatever. And they go there for restaurants and stuff like that. In Boston, there's the North End, you go for pizza and what have you. Well, why is that? And so when he got home, he used, I think it was a checkerboard and some coins. And he took like pennies and nickels. I don't remember exactly the denomination of the coins, but two different colored coins. And he randomly threw them on the board and then put each coin wherever they randomly landed in a space. And then he made a simple rule that said, if I'm, let's say, a copper penny coin, and I'm surrounded by silver colored coins, in other words, people different from me, I'm okay with that unless I'm completely surrounded. And then I want to move, and I'll move to the nearest open space. It was something like that. It's a simple rule. And then he started moving it, and lo and behold, piles of silver coins and copper coins emerged. Neighborhoods emerged. Ethnically diverse neighborhoods, or ethnically non-diverse neighborhoods emerged. And think about it. His rule was not like if a coin that isn't like me is near me, I leave. No, you had to be completely surrounded. And then you say, well, I'm the only copper coin here. But you were very tolerant of other coins. And yet you saw these, and it started randomly, right? So, and then there's a computer version of this, of course, these days and whatever. But these are the sorts of things that, well, how do these neighborhoods emerge? How do they come about? No central planner said all the German people go here and all the Italian, or whatever. They, through the interactions of individuals in that case, those neighborhoods emerge. So that's there's a lot of that stuff, and I think it needs to be. I agree with Clint. That's kind of like how do you emerge from historically from a craft industry where if you're an apprenticing to be a shoemaker, a cobbler, you learn all the things about making shoes, from cutting the leather and tanning the leather and sewing and whatever, to a mass production of shoes where you're on an assembly line doing one job. How does industry change like that? Or any of your evolutionary economists like Marx and Schumpeter and Veblen and things like that, they were describing these sorts of evolutionary processes that I think are kind of in this same camp.
If you're enjoying the show, make sure you hit the like button. And if you're really, really enjoying it, make sure you buy Clint's book. It sounds like I might need to check it out. Now, I have a shelf full of books that I still haven't read. So, Clint, I'm probably going to get your book, but there might be a waiting list as I am still trying. Okay, so here's the story. I've read the general theory 4 times, and 3 of the times I failed at finishing it, and the 4th time I actually read it, I had to speed read it just to get through it. So there's my issue with getting to all the other authors after that. I just want to let the audience know we're off for next week. We're not canceled, although we're always very close to being canceled on YouTube because of our language. But we'll be back the following week. I need to go to a wedding next week. So it means I have to get into my best suit. And I won't have time to do the graphics and stuff for the show and get it all prepped. So we'll take a week off. But nonetheless, we'll be back the following week. I'm just looking at our Twitter feed, and we've got 9 people there. So maybe those people can hit the like button, retweet, and then come over here and join the chat. I love seeing you guys chat. I'm gonna kind of because we're at the close of the first hour here. I think we get Clint to stay into the second hour if he's got time, but I want to kind of get Clint, because I make audiograms each week, Clint, as a promotional. So I'm going to pose the tough question to you. If there was one thing in economics you could change today, what would it be? In the economic system, I should say, what would that change be?
You mean in the economic system as a thing in the real world?
Yes.
I think the key thing right now, given the push for austerity, well, I'd say it'd be the over complexity, which relates to austerity. If the public understood the basic mechanics of spending and the purpose better, which is really a lot of what the MMT education is about, then we would understand why we could have good things.
Good stuff. And so I guess this is my segue where I've got to pump these guys up. I don't know if I'm going to keep using them or not, because I don't like doing this pumping up. And I've got a lot of other tools, but maybe this is the last week recast.studio because you're not giving me the services I want. But here it is. You can try out recast.studio. That's their website. You can make audiograms. That's what I do each week with them. Unfortunately, they're being a little stingy with me right now. So I guarantee you guys this will be the last time I ever plug you on this show. So make sure you frame this out and put it on your website, because after this, fuck you. And so at that point, we'll go into the next part of our show. Still friends after the show. We'll see you in a sec. Stay tuned. And we did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it. So fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning. Still friends after the show, except with recast.studio. Whatever they are, because they're stingy. Daniel, I'm going to start using actually, I found many different services now because I've kind of expanded my brand over the last few weeks. So that's the end of recast. But I did honor my deal and plug them for the final last time because I've made one last audiogram with them. What do you think, Dan?
Well, total transparency. I've got a reseller with Descript, and Descript came up out of the blue. I think it's a great tool for not only audiograms but also for video editing. I don't know if you want to look at that. If we plug that into the show, if we used my reseller with the code, I would donate 100% of it to Steve's efforts. So something to think about.
So here's my question. If we use it, do we have to plug them in the show? Because you're paying for the service, correct?
Yeah, I'm paying for the service, but ultimately the goal with putting a code out is that we want people who would use Restream or who would use Descript to sign up. And only when people sign up would we then earn money for Steve.
Okay. Well, that's maybe something we'll work together on in the background and see. Like, I do believe if we could maybe just monetize some of the show, because obviously there's the restream fees and stuff like that. It's something we can work together on in the background. Mm-hmm. Do you think we should get Clint to read the list, or do you want to read the list?
I really enjoyed Clint. I'd like to give him the opportunity, but he's in the studio. He's listening, right? So Clint, the way to do the reading of the names is with the most pizzazz, flair, enthusiasm that you can muster. So start, kind of ramping yourself up. And Clint, go for it. I want to hear you. I want to hear you read these names here.
What names am I reading? Oh, okay. Joe Polito. What is this again? Just
no. Ty,
let's start.
Take it down. We got to.
Yeah, hold on. So this is for the top chatters of the previous week, because our show thrives on all our great chatters, and we have a lot of good chatters. Without them, this isn't a live stream. It's just a podcast with a bunch of geeky guys talking on it each week. So I really like to pay homage to our viewers. So here's a list. Do your best.
All right. So we have number 1, Joe Polito and Ghost on the Half Shell, WWF on 0104, TR, Lanadel Hate the Clock, Botched Mandala, Ogum the Bold, James Keenan, Demetrius Gizelis, and Dregai.
Very good.
Yeah, that's great. I was with you all the way, but somehow my brain wanted to Andregai. I wanted to say Gregai. I don't know why, but it's just the way I gestalt it, right?
I want to point out one other thing, and I don't blame Clint for this because I'm of the age of the 80s and 90s. He said WWF instead of WWE. And we're referring to WWE fan 0104. That's Josh from Canada. That was kind of funny. The old WWF. Stone Cold Steve Austin.
And Clint, do you know of a show called We Live?
No. What is it?
I think it's with that wrestler Rowdy Piper or something like that. Anyways, We Live it's like a Marxist cultish movie that's pretty popular with undergrads in university.
But it's with a wrestler.
Yeah. We Live.
I've never been a wrestling guy, although apparently the Smashing Pumpkins guy owns a wrestling league, and they put on a combined concert wrestling show in Australia recently. Pretty bizarre. What was that?
Steve hates it when we start talking about wrestling, but
Yeah, I'm
since
not a
he's
wrestling guy, but
since he's not here, I'm letting the topic kind of drag on a little bit, but we can move on. I kind of want to talk, since you're a pretty good historian on money. I kind of want to talk about the modern origin of the private banking sector, private bank deposits. You know, maybe we could start in the 1800s when we had many different commercial banks with many different bills and notes that somehow they had to trade in the economy between each other. Maybe kind of give a brief history on what you know about that, because I've always found that to be a fascinating topic in economics.
yeah, well, although my interest at first, when I first ran across Keene, was trying to understand, this was obviously 2008. So that's, when debt deflation and all that really took off. And I mentioned in my bio, when I was first looking into some of these issues in the 90s, actually, not studying economics, but if you remember in the 90s, especially in the US, Mike, everything was about, who was that politician at the time, but about the national debt then as well. His headlines every other day in the newspapers. And that eventually led me to Irving Fisher and his early debt deflation work.
Ross
And I
Perot.
kind of, him too, but Newt Gingrich. So, the Gingrich revolution in the 90s and all that. And a couple of other guys as well, of course. But so that was my main interest. And if you get into Irving Fisher and all that on its own, it elucidates a lot, but not everything. You're still kind of lost. And that's why eventually hitting on Steve Keene way later is like, wow, it's just kind of like, all of a sudden, like the curtains have been opened on a whole nother world in a clear way that, mainstream economics has famously doesn't even have in their models. So that's how my interest got into that. Just so I'll get right back to your question, I just wanted to mention on the book two things. One, on the intro part about how hard it is to get to a system of money in a logical way. I just put a link in the private chat, which is a longer blog post a few years after the book that kind of explains the thinking behind that. And then also, if anyone is going to get the book, I really ran out of steam. I should have added another chapter kind of summarizing why it matters. Basically, I just end within the real world, we don't get government spending right, and that's it. I should have expanded on that a lot more. Anyway, to get back to the banking thing, that is not my area of expertise, really. I just looked at it from the very slow rise of credit through history. It went up and down at different times, and certainly from the early modern period is when you get modern bureaucracy, states, and institutions that are capable of doing the things that modern kind of economies do. And of course, that's when you get the slow rise of state money as you get bureaucracies that are efficient at taxing, basically. I mean, the history of chattel money is the history of taxation. It's the same thing. You automatically create tax credits if you impose a tax. So you have to have a strong, organized state that can, with a effective bureaucracy, to even make that possible. And so for basically the same reasons, and at the same time, you also get that same kind of organization within with accounting between merchants and trade, and famously the Northern Italian banks, and you see those two things mixed. For example, when the British or English government borrowed money from the Northern Italians, for the wars and all this kind of stuff. And that's when you also see proto central banks, and it's all mixed together. But I think the key, going back to emergent properties as well, is as you have urbanization, a decrease in transport costs, increased trade, you're going to get the accounting behind that. And that's all it was. Really, it was in a certain kind of historical way. You can almost see it as an inevitability of the technological and demographic changes that were happening, and political changes. So that's the rise of banking, and the only other complication is we were coming off of what I call an aberration in history, which is coins. You have you go back to the ancient city-states, your chattel money, in a way, imposed by the state, the tax, was also a commodity, paid in kind, a lot of times, grain. So you kind of have this mix of commodity and state money at the same time. And then, with the Lydians, 600 BC, around then, you get coins. Graeber makes a great point that coins were always related to warfare. You get a couple of thousand years of development where people don't know what's going on with money. So is this piece of metal important because it has a government stamp on it? Is it valuable because of the gold? What's going on with those banker guys over there with their accounting books? So you get this incredible muddle. And so you see this incredible confusion. You've got states borrowing from private banks in the 1700s, 1600s. You've got the beginnings of really pure chattel money. It's just a tax we impose. You still got people who, after a couple thousand years, they still think the money's worth what it's worth because of the gold or silver in it. So it took a long time to get all that sorted out. And the other key thing is it's 1933, 71 for the international that we're off of that. So that's incredibly recent. So I think it's no coincidence that we're just now getting the economics right, because that's just a blip in history that we've actually been on a fully tax credit system in the world. Sorry, that was more than what you asked, but
No, I want to take us back to the beginning of, I guess, recorded records. And I don't know if we're on the same page and if the audience is on the same page, but to me, the first recorded records would be the linear A and linear B. Would that be correct?
I'm not off the top of my head. I can't remember the dates on that, but I mean, the work with Denise Schmandt-Besserat, personal communication with her recently, she said she's pushed it back to like 9,000 BC now. The tokens, the famous tokens that led to cuneiform writing. So those were accounting. So the different tokens were symbols of goods. Now, originally, for a long time, when they used to find them in archaeological sites in the Middle East, they thought they were game pieces. That was when you found something you didn't understand, it was either a religious rite or a game. That was, but we don't know what it is, so we'll say that's what it is. And she actually went around all these sites and looked in the museums in Jordan and Egypt and wherever, and started cataloging them and realized that these were accounting tokens. And I don't know if are you familiar with this process, Daniel, where or Mike? So they were taking these actual physical representations. There would be like cones, balls, different geometric shapes that represented some quantity of sheep or grain or something like that. And then they started realizing, okay, instead of actually physically having these, we can press them into wet clay. So if you press a cone into wet clay, you get a triangle, and you can actually see these pressings, how they developed into cuneiform writing. So the first writing was accounting at the same time.
Wow. Yeah.
Which says a lot about society in a way. I mean, our very earliest, it wasn't Shakespeare type writing. It wasn't Greek dramas. It was boring accounting. Who has what? And related to the state. So that in a way, it's writing, it's chattel money, it's commodity money in a way, because they're actually dealing with commodities. It's everything all mixed up. The interesting thing was what it wasn't is coins, and it wasn't gold or silver. That came much later. That's why I call it an aberration in history that we ever had metallic coins.
So what dates did you say? That's interesting, because I just pulled up linear A.
Go back to about 8,000 BC or something like that.
That's interesting.
I mean, up until the development in 3,500 BC or so, which is where Graeber gets his 5,000 years in debt. So we start getting written records and a full centralized state with everything about accounting, everything else with the Sumerians.
Yeah.
So
well, I just pulled it up.
3,500.
Yeah, I just pulled it up here, and it says linear A is a writing system that was used by the Minoans in Crete from 1800 to 1450 BC.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating because that's still much later than what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
And linear A was still basically like, I think it was just an accounting. It was just, observing quantities of things.
Yeah.
And
one of the key things I write about when the origins of money stuff and the whole barter debate comes up is one of the main problems is we have the time scale wrong, which is not surprising. You have so-called economists, or political economists anyways, in the 1700s, Adam Smith and all of these guys, writing with no idea of time. So we've only really understood geological time and evolutionary time in the last 100 years or so, the true depth of it. So yeah, we just had our time scales wrong. So we're talking about things that, as far as the earliest origins of some of the trade and all that, that we might have given us standardized units that could have become these things that were taxed. You're probably talking 10, 20,000 years ago, talking about a 10,000 year period of development. Incredibly slow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, slow is kind of a relative term, but I mean, I think I want to maybe give a shout out to Lana, because in her comments she mentioned that she booked a flight to go see Steve, and I think that's amazing. Like, that's really great. So she's asking who else is speaking at that event, and who else will be speaking at the Harvard Law event in June with Steve Keen. I'm going to put this back to Ty to kind of rumble around in his head, because I want to try and figure out how we can make a connection with Lana. He may already have a connection with her, but I think we need to do an exchange. I mean, the woman has gone out and bought a ticket, and I think some off-air correspondence would be appropriate to help provide her with some more information on that, for sure. And Lana, that's amazing. I hope you get to see him, and we'll let him know that you're heading out to the event for sure. That's really cool. Now back to the record keeping, we'll say. And we could call this, I think you were leading to this, Clint, with it's like a state record keeping. Okay. Would I be appropriate? Like, would I be accurate in thinking that this is a real early form of division of labor, leading to what the results of those labors, the record keeping of the results of the labor? Would that be sort of the? I don't know if I'm forming that question correctly, but I'm looking at, we can look at this as record keeping of grain and goats and, this type of thing. But ultimately, I'm looking at what happens before that. And in any organized society or group, you've got a division of labor. So would you use that as your starting point, or would your starting point be just, the allocation and the record keeping of goods by an authoritative structure of scribes?
Well, this also goes back to my interest in causality. You kind of have, population was slowly growing, so you're starting to get urbanization. It's almost inevitable. I mean, you get urbanization, you get hierarchies, and there's just no way for a city to work without a hierarchy of, and basically somebody's got to be on top of that. So you get government, whether you want it or not. And of course, warfare played into this. Your neighbors you're gonna. So a lot of the early things that were happening, either we're dealing with the environment. So a lot of you kind of get into the old what do you call it, the hydraulic theory of society, which a lot of people poo-poo, but there's certainly some truth to it. Early states were worried about earthworks for irrigation, and controlling water was a big deal, especially in Sumeria as well as East Asia. And then military, of course. Those are kind of the two big things the state was doing. So yeah, you're going to get organized labor, and you're going to need to organize feeding them. And so a lot of the earliest records have to do with amounts of grain that a worker would need in a day. So you start getting natural units of account that could have either been palmfuls or earthenware, the typical earthenware container size, or else physiological measures like how much beer, it was mainly beer, kind of a gruelish type beer, that a worker would need a day to survive. So he needs 6 units of this. So you need accounting for that. It's also very one of the things I mentioned in my book. A lot of this was very despotic, and it was it wasn't, the earliest taxation wasn't a good thing. It was an incredible inequality, incredible, essentially slaves. So not a good thing, but we can turn that power into something good. We've understood now the power of, we tax ourselves through democracy, and we organize things we want. We no longer, force people to go, toil in a field all day. So we've modified it, but there is a certain fundamental, it's always political. This is why when you say, money is politics, really. And you can see this in the MMT story by Mosler, the most famous one. The story is the guy is holding a 9mm at the door. Are you familiar with that story?
Oh, on ethics, on whether is it whether or not you actually tell a lie, sort of thing?
No, he's at a conference and he says, these are my business cards. Will anybody give me, I can't remember how he phrased it, give me your lunch for this business card. And I'm like, no. But if you have somebody standing outside the door with a 9mm saying, to get out of this door, you can only get out by having 3 of Warren Mosler's business cards. So then he says, well, to get these business cards, you have to clean up the conference room. Well, all of a sudden you've got labor because you've imposed the liability. So you impose the liability, you enforce it, and then that gives value to his business cards. There is always an underlying force, and a lot of people, I suppose you could say on the left or whatever, don't like that story, but it's just a fact. I mean, our tax credits are only, so that's also why we say taxation is the second most important thing of how we define sovereignty. And it's a direct consequence of the first thing, which is power. I mean, sovereignty is a monopoly on force in a region. And so even from Sumerian times, you get, and it's not a nice start. It's just a reality of humans. If you want to organize stuff, you need some hierarchical structure. And if you then they were using it in a despotic way, build my pyramid. Now we do it, ideally we impose that liability on ourselves to build a hospital. So we've channeled this system that is at heart brute force. And that's why everybody's scared of the IRS, or I don't know, in Canada, what do you call your IRS?
CRA.
The CRA. Does it have the same ring as IRS in the United States?
Yes, it's the Canada Revenue Agency, and it is thought of in the same light as the IRS.
Well, there's a reason for
in the
that.
States.
I mean, backing up the CRA or the IRS in every country in the world is force. And we don't tend to kill people anymore. But you can literally get thrown in jail, which is the closest, thing we do. So yeah, force backs up our state money system, and there's just no way around that. It's never not been that way. We've just channeled it into a more productive democratic form, and that was what all the fights in the early modern period were about. As we went from absolutism in some cases to the best we can do with democracy.
So, Clint,
Sorry, Dan. I want to remind everybody to if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment in the video after the show. That helps with the algorithm. If you have any questions, burning questions that you can't really articulate now in the chat, but you want to ask Clint, you can put them underneath the video. If any come up for Clint and he doesn't see them, I'll make him aware of them and he will get back to you. Mike, I just want to kind of bring you into the conversation just because it's been 25 minutes since we've heard from you. So what's going on?
Well, I've just been listening intently, and it's interesting stuff. I do have a question for Clint, given that he's an economic geographer as well as a modern monetary theory person. And I remember as a student studying not economic geography, but regional and urban economics. And there was a whole section of the course about how economic development occurs where you have deep harbors so ships can get in there, and navigable rivers so boats can make their way up the river for trade and this sort of thing. And it made a lot of sense to me, like why cities are located where they're at and what have you. But in modern times where we have more of an ideas economy, I'm wondering what economic geographers say about location theory and what have you in light of that.
Well, one thing about that is geography became a bit like economics. Economics quit incorporating state and bank money in their systems. Geographers quit studying geography in the last 40 or 50 years. Everything was environmental determinism, they called it. Any kind of integration of environmental or geographic factors was actually rejected, and kind of went off on a postmodern, I don't know, it got really bad. So yeah, it was taboo to say, San Francisco's there because of the massive natural perfect port there. So I was actually trying to bring that back in to economic geography from the very long perspective of, like I said, where things happen matters, certainly for, the modern day. It matters that the Industrial Revolution happened, in far northwest Eurasia and not in Central Asia. We'd live in a different world if the heartland of the Industrial Revolution was Mongolia. And somehow people forget that. And you've got that at all scales. Paul Krugman, actually, he had a couple of years where he got really into economic geography. He did some really interesting stuff. We call it geographic economics, not economic geography. But he did, he said something about it. He described it, and this is a common idea within economic geography from 100 years ago, but as a seed. So natural harbors and, all these different things cause things to conglomeration to happen where it did. And then the knock-on effects from that are huge, and the emergent effects that grow there. But part of the explanation always has to be some of the geographical factors as well. I mean, where coal was matters, or where mines are, even if you're looking at, say, colonization, look at colonization of Australia or California had to do with actually where gold was, So these things matter, but it matters kind of at a base level, setting the locations, and then you get this seed of emergent behavior that happens in those locations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you get again into this idea of path dependency, where, I'm a car dealer, and where do I want to locate my car dealership? Well, I can locate it way over there where there's no other car dealers, so I'm unique. Or I can go to the auto mile outside of Boston, where when people are looking for a car, they just drive up and down. And
right. And why is Detroit in Detroit? Let's talk about your agglomeration.
Yeah, right. Well, you do have the Great Lakes there, but right, once you get the snowball rolling down the hill, the positive feedback loops start to kick in, where people want to be near diamond merchants, want to be next to other diamond merchants, and what have you.
So part of any complete explanation that gets the spatial location anchored it's got to have geographic factors. That tends to be on the longer scale, larger processes. But if you want a satisfactory answer, that's got to be part of the answer. And within mainstream geography, any use of a geographic factor in that fashion was dismissed. That's environmental determinism. No, you're out of here. So they also kind of went off the rails a little bit as well.
So
well, go ahead, finish that, Mike. Sorry.
So following up on this idea of location and spatial aspects. So Steve Keen and his Minsky software package do dynamic modeling. I do dynamic modeling in a parallel sort of world. The stock flow consistent modeling folks also in a parallel fashion do dynamic modeling. But all of our models are typically devoid of spatial aspects. And when that's pointed out to us, we start hemming and hawing. There's a lot of hand waving that goes on. There are people here and there that try to integrate geographic information systems with system dynamics software and what have you. But I'm wondering, in your mind's eye, Clint, if you could discuss how spatial aspects might be profitably added to dynamic modeling, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure. So it's funny you mentioned Schelling earlier with the cities, and you have the really old tradition within geography of von Thunen and Christaller. It's funny you're in Worcester too. Historically considered the best geography university in the United States is Clark University, right there in Worcester. Anyway,
my department has a geography PhD from Clark. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of Americans don't know that, partly because geography was kicked out of the Ivy League a long time ago. That's another story. So yeah, you kind of have two different things. And Krugman, this is why we call it geographic economics. You get what we call agglomerating forces, which have to do with externalities, knowledge spillovers, network effects. That they're these abstract forces that cause agglomeration. For example, there's quite a few, and dispersion and other things, but networks of cities and all this stuff. And those kind of happen anywhere, but they're still not anchored. And then what I tried to explain was you always still need an anchoring thing. And this is where Krugman had a good phrase about the seed of, so yeah, you get agglomerating effects, say for the auto industry in Detroit, but something happened to make it be there. I mean, in the real world, there. And it can be these abstract historical things. It can have to do with where resources and transportation come together. But somewhere in that story, there will always be a real thing. And that will be not the abstract force agglomerating forces, which are also important and geographic concept, but actual geography, where a river is, where a mine is. Just real quick, somebody in the comments wrote, "You don't understand colonization in Australia or the history of gold discovery." I didn't mean to say that that's the entire colonization of Australia, by the way. I briefly lived in Melbourne, though, and certainly the gold rush, I think it was 1851 or whatever, had a great deal to do with the development of Victoria and Melbourne. So anyway, just like California isn't just the gold rush, it just radically changed what California became. Just a quick aside for transcription there.
Wow. Well, hold on. Wow. You are on the ball, Clint. I was looking at that. And I guess I missed what you said, but good response.
Yeah.
I've never, it's okay. I've never seen this person on our show before, so I doubt he'll ever come back. I'm really not a good host, I should be welcoming to everybody, but you know what? We'll just take his comment down and continue on.
Oh no, it's fine. That's not the best example. There's much better examples of where things are and why. But yeah, there's the agglomerations we talk about, like I think it's called Dalton. I think it's in Georgia that they've specialized in making carpets. Why does anything? Of course, that's why I said I started the Industrial Revolution. I mean, why did the textiles and the coal and the various the early control of pressure, which is the fundamental change that set off the Industrial Revolution, with steam particularly. So trains and the early they were originally using them to get water out of the very mines that they were mining. And they had to figure out how to, and material science comes into this. How can you make a vacuum? Making a vacuum was a massive development in technological advancement at that time.
We got a question here. You might be able to answer it. Does Clint have any thoughts on the Bancor system? Steve's mentioned he would have preferred it, but what does Clint think?
So just about everybody looks at it international. This gets into the whole thing. So MMT, sovereign money, sovereignty. So you have your tax credit that drives the money in your country, right? But you get down to this basic question though, okay? I need US dollars to pay my taxes. You need Canadian dollars to pay your taxes. In Poland, they need zlotys to pay their taxes. That's their tax credit. But why would I ever want a Polish tax credit? If I'm in the US, the only possible reason if I want to buy something from Poland, right? So you get into thinking, so the internally, the charter money makes sense. But at the international level, everything's different, totally different. There's two ways to look at that. You could say, okay, we have a system to where we have world trade, for hundreds of years. And then, so everybody is going to want somebody else's money because everybody wants something from that country. If nothing else, tourism, if I go to Poland or Nigeria or wherever, I need their local currency probably. So at the very minimum, you have some demand for that. But then another way to look at it would be like, well, maybe our international unit is the sum of all the taxes in the world. So in other words, it does work on an international level because every country taxes. So whatever the international unit is, there still can be demanded as well. That's two kind of opposite ways to look at it. This is also, I was trying to get back to commodities. So commodity always inherently they can be money-like because they're divisible, they're storable, they're uniform, so they're fungible. You trade these between countries, and that's a lot of times what you want. So like you probably import all of your coffee in Canada, for example. But when you get into the international arena, everything's different. And the banker makes sense from the, I think most people, when they look at the international economy, they think, yeah, it would surely make sense to have a banker and something that's not tied to any one country. Because that's what I mean. The US dollar is the international currency, but why in the world does somebody in Japan want a US tax credit, right? It's doing something else at the international level. They don't want a US tax credit, really. They use it to trade with Brazil, So what's going on there? So I think you get into some real interesting questions. I did a series of blog posts, actually, my most recent ones, thinking about this. And I think the quick answer, though, the main thing I think that doesn't get enough attention was during Bretton Woods, there was a Canadian proposal and a French proposal, Keynes proposal, but there was the main guy was a guy named Williams, an economist Williams, and it was the Williams proposal. And that's what we have now, ever since we went off. And he called it the key currency proposal. And that gets back to emergent properties. If you have 100 nations, all with their own money, even if they were all equal, you would end up with one of them becoming the key currency, just because of network effects. Because you need one currency that Japan and Brazil can say, hey, we're going to contract on, and then Brazil, say they're the receiver, can say, yeah, I also want to buy some stuff from Mexico, and they know that they can do that. So you've got to have at least one currency be international. That's the idea behind the banker. But Williams said it's going to happen, and then once you have some countries that have larger economies than the other and trade more, the dominant country is going to become that key currency. It's almost inevitable. This gets into emergent effects and all. And that's what we have post. It gets complicated. I did a series. My last 3 or 4 posts were thinking about these issues ever since the Ukraine war, COVID in the Ukraine war. A lot of people attention. Sorry.
I'll let Clint. We can find these posts on your website, correct?
Yeah, clintballinger.com.
Okay. Everybody, make sure you check out Clint's website. Check out his blogs. Blogs are always fun to read because you can get the opinion, the unfiltered opinion of the individual writing them. So make sure you check that out. Continue your train of thought there, Clint.
Well, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but basically if you start looking into it, it gets super complex really fast, as you can imagine. But I think Posar's, Sultan Posar, he kind of got famous talking about commodities in after the Ukraine war. He was already famous for other stuff, but Nathan Tankes has been writing on his work quite a bit lately as well for other reasons. But just the idea of when the wheat of Russia and Ukraine started becoming a global issue, and Russia, mining and then using its gold as its reserves because we froze their US dollar assets, and the idea of what currency, people thinking that the Chinese renminbi is going to replace the dollar, and all this conversation, it really gets you thinking about what's the role of money in the international sphere. And like I said, chartalism doesn't really fit that, at least on the surface, because why do I want anyone else's tax credit if I don't, So key currency theory explains why it's going to be one currency from whichever country tends to be dominant economically, and that's going to happen more or less naturally. But is that the best system? As we know, it causes problems for the U.S. because we have to fulfill the savings desires of the rest of the world. If we buy a bunch of stuff from China, they end up with dollars. That's just the way it is. So we have to always run a deficit, and that messes up our domestic politics. So you get into a lot of different issues.
Nice. Dan, what's going on there, buddy, up in the top corner?
I was just clicking away, looking at Clint's blog, and it's pretty interesting. In terms of forces of determinism, I mean, you brought up a couple things like environmental determinism as a way to refute geography in an explanation, and I as an outsider looking in, I think, why is that even entertained? Right? I mean, you're not saying that that's the full determining factor. Not like what was that one book, Guns, Steel, and Germs, or whatever. And I thought I'd ask you about that. Are you familiar with that Guns, Germs, and Steel book, Clint?
Yes, I actually briefly met Jared Diamond. So yeah, geographers hate Jared Diamond because
Yeah. Okay. Good.
he had the nerve. It's crazy. He got appointed. He was in I think it was Borneo, but somewhere Papua New Guinea, Borneo, somewhere. Studying birds. That's his original kind of biology oriented. But he was there for like 20 years, and he started having some of these other questions about basically geography and development, as you might. And he wrote that book, and the public likes it, and geographers hated that book, hated it because he had the nerve to say that geographic factors matter at all. And I think geographic factors are beginning to get more integrated. Interestingly, the other best people who dared to put geographic factors back in because they weren't being the groupthink of the academic geographers was economists. So Darren Acemoglu, however you say his name, I never get that right. There was a handful of economists writing some big his pieces about economic development. And I think they realized inherently that, some of these long-term geographic processes, economic processes, you've got to bring some geography in. One of the best papers actually that set it off was actually the early 90s, Ingerman and Sokoloff. And they wrote a paper trying to understand how institutions differed in the Americas from South America to North America and the overall greater economic development in North America over the long term. Because in the earlier days, for example, Argentina for a while was the richest country in the world, I believe. So how did that switch? And they said, well, it's institutions. And they wanted to look at how the institutions evolved. And their paper, these were economists writing, that basically the plantation agriculture that suited the tropics led to institutions. You've got the plantations and all this, which led to more or less despotic and dysfunctional institutions, whereas the grain agriculture of the plains of North America led to small land holdings and were inherently more friendly towards the development of democratic institutions that in the long run proved more stable. I'm not saying it's that simple, but that's basically what their paper argued for. You have people in an intelligent way bringing in these factors in, mediated through institutions, and it's highly complex. And there's nothing deterministic about it in the sense that people hated geographic determinism as being those people are stupid because they live in a jungle type of idea. It's much that, but the idea that geography didn't affect trade and the development of different types of institutions at the government level and these types of things, banking, all kinds of things, then it certainly did. Where and how it developed with very
libertarian. Yeah, so the libertarian would say that the institutions are inherently evil. I mean, by evil, I mean perversion or ultimately a corrupt form of self-organization. And so could you make the claim in your work that the best way to encourage a structure of geographical organization or economic organization with geography being a part of the whole would be that it needs to be pluralistic? Like, I'm almost don't believe that in saying that, but I'm trying to figure out how to bridge something with the libertarians that makes sense, that doesn't make the discipline of economics inherently top down or government spend centric. We talked about MMT earlier on in the show, and effectively, I think what the bipartisan argument here is that the partisan argument that comes from the other side, Republicans versus Democrats in the United States, is to say that this is an open check to one side or one ideological political side of the aisle, and this just means like untethered sort of spending by one form of the government versus another one. And so rather than throw the libertarians under the bus, and that's a long sort of like soliloquy there, Clint, but how do you, and the question goes for Mike too, I mean, how do you reconcile this with the libertarians as, I guess I would say like, I guess, yeah, that's very simple. How do you reconcile this with the libertarians and maximize individual freedoms without having it under the thumb of the government?
Well, I think one quick aside, I think the role of think tanks has been decisive. I think the think tanks have been incredibly effective at perverting the discourse ever since the 1940s, 1950s, when but so a lot of it comes back to property, as so many things do, and property rights. The libertarian conception of property is just wrong from the beginning. It's not logical. And once you get the idea of property rights wrong, everything's going to be wrong after that. The idea that's part of the reason I did the 1,000 castaways, the setup I did. If you get 1,000 people together in the middle of nowhere, you're going to want to do some things as a group, for sure. And that's all that public spending ever is doing things as a group. At times that's more efficient or more logical or whatever. So sorry, Mike, I'll let you jump in there.
Yeah, I guess, traditionally in economics, we say we debate in public sector economics when there's a proper role for the government, right? And I guess from the traditions in at least in the United States, it's when markets can't handle something or handle something well, and you get free rider effects and what have you. It's if you pay for defense for the country and I don't, I benefit too. So how do you get me to pay? Well, you tax to handle it. The issue of private property, that goes to, at least in the United States, to the heart of the matter. I mean, people get really, this is my land, this is my car, this is, and there's quite a, I don't know what you call it, independence streak or something like that related to that concept. And I don't know, Clint mentioned if you get that wrong, how, if it's gotten wrong, how do you undo it? I don't know how you sort of dig out a mindset like that from the public. I think it's just a heck of a thing.
Sort of touching on that, related, because you were talking about the role of government. One of my favorite books that I wish people would read on government, sort of Canadian. It was by Jane Jacobs, actually. So you're familiar with Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, that
Yep.
later went to Toronto.
She
She
knew more about cities than urban economists did.
Oh yeah, she's great. She also wrote a book called Systems of Survival. And it was really interesting. What she did was she took, in her very kind of intuitive way, the same way she wrote Urbanism, by going and sitting in the parks in Greenwich Village in New York City and actually seeing what's happening in the real world. She spent a number of years cutting, this is before the internet, every article she could find and just collecting that anything that talked about government spending or private spending or these kind of issues. And then she started just classifying them. I mean, I'm imagining like little cutout newspaper articles on her floor or whatever, and just like what's going on here. And she ended up realizing that there's a divide. It's a moral divide between what we think government should do versus what we think the private sector should do. And she says that the one comes from commerce, as you can see on the title there, commerce, trade, could be production as well to some extent. And then what the government should do. So what she noticed in the articles is what is perceived as moral behavior by government is totally different than what we perceive as moral behavior by commerce. To give an example, say we want our government, for example, our military. Military is fundamentally government, and we want them to, if they needed to in a war, use deception. We want them to be very top-down, hierarchical, command, things like this. But we don't view those things as good in commerce. Commerce is about being, there's just a whole different set of moral precepts. And if you read that book, I can't do it justice because I didn't even think to bring it up right now, but we get confused. So, for example, education is inherently the moral aspects around it tend to be closer to government, what she calls the guardian mentality. So when we mix these two things is where we get into problems. So example, private uses of force. We don't private police forces or anything like that's bad because you're mixing commerce and what is a government function. A lot of the attempts by the neoliberals to marketize everything, that's mixing what she calls them syndromes. Government, what should be kept separate. So we need to understand why in commerce and private production does what it does and why government does what it does. Again, I can't do it justice like the book does, but it's very good, and it really makes you look at everything through a different lens where you can see why it's a different angle into why a neoliberal idea of marketizing everything is not only not going to work, but it actually creates evil institutions, basically.
I think we also get in the modern world into the issue of the government working, collaborating with the private sector, often behind the scenes to get things done. Certainly during the pandemic, the government went to the various pharmaceutical companies, and I don't know what deals were struck. We'll buy so many millions of doses if you just drop what you're doing and get on this thing. You might say that was a righteous thing to do, but I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on with big tech and what have you. And so you really don't have a capitalist system in the sort of textbook sense. You have the public sector over here preparing the environment for commerce and, protecting the commonweal. And then you have within that environment and the rule of law and whatever, you have commerce that proceeds, and they're kind of separate. I think there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that even the public is not aware of. And I'm cautious about that stuff. It could be like in the case of the pandemic, it probably was for the common good. I don't know for sure, but we did get the vaccines out fairly quickly. But a lot of stuff, I don't know. There's a lot of probably sketchy stuff that goes on behind the scenes. And what do you call that? I'm not sure if it's fascism. I don't know what the term is, but I just think there's a lot of that goes on.
I just posted a thing too. I tried to kind of go at this issue as well in a tweet thread, talking about looking at the economy, about why it would make sense to be government, what it makes sense to be private, and what falls in between there. I just posted on the live thread here.
We got a comment here. Right on, Clint. Libertarians are illogical. They adopt a philosophy that suits their irrationality. It's ironic because the Ayn Randians would basically say they use they want to maximize the individual's ability to use reason. So it's interesting about how those two are at polar opposites.
Well, so I talk about in one of my posts, I invented a term from mainstream economics. I call it the well-being production frontier instead of the production possibility frontier. So if a group of people wanted to maximize their well-being, they would choose to do certain things. And that's where I got into Jacobs, which ones you have to think about why. Certain things, though. Either because they have network effects or because a group can do them better as a whole. So the group of libertarians that insisted on only doing things individualistically, that could work for some things, of course, but you're going to be missing out on some low-hanging fruit of things you could do to improve all of your well-being than doing them as a group. So there's an inherent kind of tension there, of course, but the idea that we don't gain as a whole in our well-being by choosing to do some big things as a group, is insane. It kind of comes back to the work of Mariana Mazzucato. I think her emphasis that was so long out of style in mainstream economics, but looking at things that the state has done that, look at like all the computer stuff that came out of NASA or all these just, Silicon Valley is there because of, unfortunately, a lot of it military, but still we wouldn't be here on this live chat now if all the technology from all the mainly military stuff happened, government stuff happened in Silicon Valley,
Yeah, it's interesting. So Joe was very polite to say there's something in the Canadian water, and it's probably from my bringing up the libertarian piece and welcoming them to the table in this conversation of dialogue. And I do return to them, not because I'm at the heart of my understanding a libertarian or my dogma as a libertarian, but I find that it's you look at the United States in any social science study, and it is a quintessential definition of the individual in terms of population. And so I think that individual self-interest um, and how we realistically, I guess, integrate is something that is not taken properly into account from our current neoliberal reality. And I find that also the definition of neoliberal gets skewed depending on what side of the political divide you are in, because I hear people define neoliberalism, and I know the academic side is more of what Clint has described neoliberalism as, but there's also the Democrats will say this is any overreaching government power that's anything from United Nations to large scale organizations that or government groups that are trying to take away the sovereignty of nations as a new neoliberal order. So you have two competing definitions of even what neoliberalism is. Like, yeah, Clint.
Well, I would just say I think the simplest definition is wanting, the liberals focused on markets, hundreds of years, Adam Smith, neoliberal, they want to make everything a market. Where I think people get, and there's the politics of the libertarian thing is always going to be there. It's what do we want to do as a group and what do we not want to do as a group? That's all it is.
Yeah.
And it's just obvious that we benefit from doing quite a few. And then a lot of, when I say we need to talk about fiscal policy more, not monetary policy, is it all comes down to how we tax and spend. It's all fiscal, the details. What are we going to do, and we can invest our public stuff in ways that can further our future production and well-being. So, and it's just those basic questions. There's always going to be a tension of how much. The neoliberal, thinking of that as international, I think that just comes from the idea that if you're going to make everything a market, you kind of get into corporate structure, and the corporations tend to be inherently supranational. So that's kind of you could say that the aspect of making everything a market also erodes the idea of the sovereign state on the world stage in a way. It's pro-corporate, you might say. But it's not direct. I mean, neoliberalism is the idea that everything should be a market. And where that runs afoul of Jane Jacobs, that I recommend that book again, is there's a lot of things that should not be a market for good reasons, moral reasons.
Very good explanation.
Clint, where can you buy your book?
Anywhere, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. There's paperback, hardback, softback. There's e-versions in just about every platform. Tried to make it cheap. Like I said, I would rewrite some things. I should have put a 6th chapter and explained more of what I'd talked about. But yeah, it's available on, I think, Kobo or whatever it's called, Barnes and Noble's ebook format. What's the Amazon's? I can't even remember. Kindle, sorry. I tried to keep it as cheap as I possibly can. I don't make pretty much any money off of it. It's the minimum production cost plus maybe 50 cents.
So,
Perfect. Oh, Mike, go ahead.
I'm fidgeting in my chair again, right? So in terms of emergent structures, Clint, I thought I would ask your opinion about this notion that as we go forward in the 21st century, there'll be trading blocks that form. One could argue that now, sort of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, they're trying to form a trading block, and then the US would most likely form a block with, Canada and the UK and New Zealand, Australia, possibly Mexico. And so and then there's the European Union. So you'd have these big sort of economic trading powers that are beyond the nation state emerging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets down to a really inherent-ish tension once again between governance being local or global. So once again, even at the supranational level, we have problems. Climate's the most obvious one that we've got to cooperate on. So how do you do that? But at the same time, humans, I talk in urbanism, I always say our legs haven't gotten any longer. Maybe we should still build cities like they did 4,000 years ago, walkable. You get that we're also still human in our social networks and what we can actually do and want in our lives. So, and I think a lot of the problem is local governance and how we feel effective within our government structure. And so you've got this inherent tension between basically we would kind of all like a relatively small polity that we feel, that we're a part of. And then you have some issues that are so big that it seems like they're only effectively dealt with at the large scale. So whenever anything you talk about supranational, whether it's trading blocks or whatever, you're going to get that tension. There's no answer to it. Sorry, that didn't exactly address your question, but I think that's the basic issue we're dealing with is size of our government.
Governance structures that supersede the nation state is really tricky business. Yeah.
Right. I mean, even in Canada, what are you, 40 something million people now? 45 million? I mean, you can easily feel like you're not having any real say in what happens at the national level. I mean, it's a problem of feeling how effective we are at with our government. And so when you start dealing with the international problems, that's just even more so. But we obviously have huge global level problems that we have to do it. So I don't know the answer. There is no answer. It's going to sort itself out politically. We just have to hope the path dependency doesn't take us in weird directions. That was a downer.
I think you're muted, Ty.
Well,
I struck Ty.
YouTube's like they've censored just him in the thing. It's because he's swearing. It's like lots of F-bombs, and now it's like Ty's rise to stardom was just like beep boop. All right, no more.
The story of all my endeavors in life. I was trying to say this has been actually, I say this with each guest, but every guest brings a very unique aspect to the show, and it has been an honor to have you for 2 hours. We are definitely going to connect you and Steve. I know you're going away next month, but we'll kind of coordinate something maybe for July or August so we can make that connection happen, I think.
Okay, I might be able to have some time. I'll be in San Jose with basically I'm going to be in the jungle for much of the summer. So but there'll be 3 or 4 days here and there that I'll be in San Jose. So we'll see if we can do it sooner. If not, then August would be great.
Okay, we'll try to sort something out. I'll do my final plug for Recast Studio. I'm not going to use you guys anymore. During the show, I found your competitor Veed.io. That's VEED.io. They are superior to you guys, and they're willing to provide the services I need. So I'll delete this banner now. We don't need that shit anymore. I'd like to thank all of our viewers for sticking with us for 2 hours. You guys are great. I'm going to get Dan to read the list because, hey, he might as well have a turn too. Dan, go ahead.
Joe Polito, Ghost on the Half Shell, WWE Fan 0104, TR, Lana Dell, Hates the Clock, Botched Mandela, Ogam the Bold, James Keenan, Demetrius Gazellis, and Dragai.
I just had to get the button pressing out of my system. I mean, our live audience. Anyways, it's been great for Mike, Dan, and Clint. We'll see Clint again. We'll make that work. But next week we're not here. Remember, I've got to go to a wedding, so I'm sorry. But the following week we have a very special guest again. So we'll see you then. Bye-bye.